So I see my duty as sort of two-part role today. One is, I think, to provide a long history of the church community, in particular by grounding it in changes within the institution, and in particular in the 1970s. But secondly, maybe in part to answer Beverly, to speak to Beverly's point about this lesser-known pipe committee in the House, to answer some questions that I think we haven't done a sufficient job answering, which is why was the Senate investigation, I think, more successful than the House inquiry? So I'll speak to those 2 points, and I want to begin by saying something about a project that I've been working on for the past year. Probably about 15 months ago, I attended a church committee panel sponsored by one of the law schools in Washington, D.C. And while I was there in the audience, I soon learned that it wasn't just the panelists who were speaking about their church committee experience. There were several staff members, former staff members. Bill Miller, the staff director, was one of the panelists. Walter Mondale was also there. But the audience was filled with church committee staffers, and they were all very eager to talk about what they remembered about their role in the investigation. So one of the projects that we do in the Senate Historical Office is document changes through the institution over time by speaking to its staff, long-serving Senate staff, because they're the closest, frankly, to the action. They're the people who staff the committees. They're the people who serve as chiefs of staff and handle some of those very challenging political problems. And so we try and catch them, typically soon after their retirement, to ask them questions about the changes in the institution that they witnessed during their time there. So since I had all these committee staffers in the audience and they seemed so eager to talk about their experience and they didn't have time on the panel, I just started passing out my cards and asking them if I could follow up to do some oral histories with them. So over the past 15 months, that's what I've been doing. I've been interviewing, now the collection totals 16 individuals. One of them is Walter Mondale. The other 15 are Senate staffers on the committee. I'm thinking now I should probably ask Ethan, since he's here, if he might want to participate. I have deeds of gift for about 14 of those interviews, so I can speak comfortably about them today, knowing that this material will be released, I would say probably in the fall of this year, in part to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the creation of this committee. And I'm going to use some of the material from those interviews I think, to explore some questions that we haven't done a decent job of exploring as scholars. Even though we've had 40 years of very good scholarship, and of course beginning with Locke Johnson's excellent book, A Season of Inquiry, there are still some things, I think, particularly from my perspective as an institutional historian, that we'd like to know more about. And that's in part what I'll be talking about today. So just to begin, I think, to this point of the Senate and the culture of the institution in the 1970s, if we want to talk about the long history of the Church Committee, we actually have to go back 20 years before that, because Senator Mike Mansfield was the first senator in the 1950s to support a resolution, to submit a formal resolution asking his colleagues to establish a special investigation of the CIA specifically. This really becomes Mike Mansfield's pet project over the next 20 years, and this is a good reminder, I think, to all of us that sometimes we have to play the long game with politics. Mike Mansfield was patient, and he waited until just the right moment when he recognized that he would have bipartisan support for such an investigation. And of course, by 1975, that investigation goes far beyond the CIA, and really is sparked by evidence that these intelligence activities are happening in the United States. They're domestic surveillance programs, and they're happening throughout a variety of federal institutions. But more importantly, to this point about the late 60s and 1970s in the U.S. Senate, we really have to look at this, as Beverly suggested, as a time there's a deep impulse within the Senate in the 1970s of inquiry and oversight, a recognition by Democrats, and importantly, this is really important in a piece of the story I think we need to do a better job of telling, Republicans, many of them moderate Republicans, who say that the president that Congress has been derelict in its duty, has not exercised effective or consistent oversight over these many years, these decades now, of the growth of the national intelligence community, and that Congress needs to reassert its prerogatives. So why does this happen in 1975? Well, we know the Hirsch story so well, and that's such an important piece of this, but if we go back even a couple more years, we can look at some of these really intense investigations that are happening in a very deliberative way in the U.S. Senate, and they're very related. They really lay the groundwork in a number of ways for the Church Committee inquiry. The first one is something I've written about in my book, which is Sam Ervin's investigation in 1970 of a domestic Army surveillance program. Really important. It's significant that it's done and handled very carefully, very intelligently by conservative Democrat Sam Ervin of North Carolina, who will go on, in part because of his work on this issue, to chair the Watergate Committee. That certainly lays some of the groundwork. And I want to point to the fact, too, that several of his staff from this Army domestic surveillance inquiry later go on to serve on the Watergate and the Church Committee. So I think that one thing we can do a better job of doing is remembering who these untutored little jerks might be on the Church Committee, because many of them are in fact not untutored, and that's really the insult of that quote, because they have not only Senate experience, but they have particular investigation experience on these very sensitive issues related to national security. And that's going to be so important to the way in which the Church Committee investigation not only rolls out, but the way in which it's received by the Senate, importantly, because it's the Senate, after all, who's going to have to consider some of these legislative recommendations. So you've got a guy, one of the people I've interviewed, Albert Snyder, who worked for Senator Ervin. He was a North Carolinian. He had a law degree. He had served in the I believe he was in the Marines during Vietnam, and Senator Ervin really liked his profile. So he came and worked on the investigation into Army domestic surveillance, and he was actually the principal author on the final report of that investigation. Then you go forward another year, and you have Maryland Republican Charles Mathias, known as Mac Mathias, who was a moderate Republican, very well respected by his peers, and in 1971, he calls for a special inquiry. He says, look, we've got this problem. This expansion of the war in Southeast Asia, we've tried to stop. We can't, because the administration is calling upon these literally like 150-year-old emergency powers, drawing upon Civil War era emergency powers to fund these military efforts. So he says, Mathias says, we've got to do something about this. Congress needs to act. So on the request of a Republican senator during the Republican presidential administration, the Senate creates this special committee. It's a little-known committee, probably you've heard of it, but it does some really important work. It's known as the Special Committee to Terminate the National Emergency. And what they did for 4 years, actually, I don't believe that they conclude their efforts until 1975 during the Church Committee inquiry. For those 4 years, they're literally looking into the statutes that presidents have used and invoked over the years, that Congress has approved at a presidential request for over 150 years. And in the end, they compiled this list of more than 400 statutes that have granted the presidents, many presidents, Democrats and Republicans, extraordinary powers. Congress has again been derelict and has not revoked these powers over the 150 years. And so you've got this great combination of things going on. You've got Republicans saying this stuff has to stop. John Sherman Cooper, a Republican from Kentucky, being one of them, of course, one of the co-sponsors of the Church Cooper Amendment, working on these issues of war powers, but more importantly, sort of trying to reassert congressional authority and prerogative in these areas. And important to note that on this committee to terminate the national emergency, there are two chairs. Frank Church is one of the chairs, but his co-chair, which that title grants special powers to the minority member, is Mac Mathias. And Mac Mathias goes on, of course, to serve in the Church Committee, and the Church himself is the chairman. So 2 things I'm trying to get at here. One is this impulse of oversight and investigation. But secondly is that it's very much a Republican and Democratic effort. And I think we've often overlooked that, and it's something that deserves further exploration. Second, and this speaks to really what both Laura and Ethan have mentioned, which is the enormity of this task. You've got this staff, the peak staff is about 150 people. They're tasked with this extraordinary task. Congress has been derelict in its duty for decades to look into, investigate in a comprehensive way these intelligence activities. So where do you begin? And that was really one of the questions that I posed to all of the people who I've interviewed. Where did you begin? How did you start? What did you do? And the great thing was, and this is again the connection to the institutional knowledge here, is that many of these folks had served on these other committees. Britt Snyder knew where to look for some of the Army surveillance stuff, and he had leads from other things. He actually ends up being one of the fellows tasked with tracking down the No Such Agency, or the NSA. So we can talk when we handle some of our questions here at the end. Maybe we can talk about the legacy with the NSA and then maybe some mixed results, as Laura suggests. But I'd also like to say that literally nobody knew about this agency in 1975, so that in itself is deserving of recognition. So Britt Snyder is one of these fellows who's working on these things. You have another couple people who I interviewed who worked on the Watergate Committee. One of them was Howard Baker's legal counsel on Watergate, and then served as his legal counsel on the Church Committee. You've got another woman who worked in the Research Center for both Watergate and the Church Committee investigation. And if you think about it,
you have 2 minutes.
I have 2 minutes, okay. Yay, thanks. Okay, so let me just say that literally, you probably all remember, but we should mention it again, that literally these 2 committees inhabit the same spaces in the Senate, and that's for a really good reason, because the Watergate Committee sets up a really careful security apparatus. They hire security to come in and to guard these documents, and they use the same type of arrangement when they initiate the Church Committee inquiry. So the Senate has this experience with managing and controlling documents and information, and it's done it responsibly. The House doesn't have the same kind of experience, and so I think that does give us that does help explain in some ways the differences between the Senate and House investigations. There's a lot more there we can unpack and explore. But let me just conclude with a couple of questions that I'd like us to consider moving forward as scholars, as a community of people who still care deeply about this stuff. First of all, how do we evaluate institutional and legislative outcomes 40 years later? I think we need to know more about the institutions in order to appreciate the legislative outcomes, and I think that institutional component is something that's lacking in our scholarship. I have found in doing these oral histories that the creation of the Permanent Intelligence Oversight Committee in the Senate was not a foregone conclusion at all, by any means, which I thought was fascinating, and I'm definitely going to be exploring that further. There were powerful individuals in the Senate who resisted it. You can imagine who those people were. John Stennis was one of them, but there were others as well, and that tells us something about both the historic moment that allows for the Church Committee investigation, but then also the limitations of that investigation that we always need to be mindful of. And then another point that comes up in the interviews is that Howard Baker actually wanted a joint committee. He wanted a joint Intelligence Oversight Committee, and because of what happens in the House, he just gives up on that plan. He realizes it's not going to happen. Also, I think we need to pay more attention to the very vibrant floor debates as the Senate and House are considering these legislative possibilities after the Church Committee investigation, because it does tell us a lot about sort of the pushes and pulls among Democrats and Republicans. Remember, these are less homogenous political groups at this time. You have conservatives and liberals in both parties. So I think we need to pay more attention literally to what the lawmakers are saying about their objections to some of this legislation in order to help us understand sort of the 40 years later, maybe FISA doesn't work so well. We need to understand that moment when FISA is born, I think, better in order to understand how we might need to approach revisions in the future. So I'll leave it there and we can do questions later. Thank you.